This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Giovanni, Shiloh, and Manisha.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on the Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Giovanni. Thank you for being with us today. Today, I'll be flying solo, and I want to talk about diplomacy. So, war is a failure of diplomacy. This was said by Michigan Representative John Dingler. And indeed, so far in this 21st century has been a century of global war with one diplomatic blunder after another. At least 6 countries have been destroyed in this century, with millions dead and tens of millions displaced as a result of it. If you were born in 2001, there hasn't been a single day that U.S. has not either been involved in a war directly, indirectly, or is conducting a war by proxy or by other means, destabilizing and instigating, starting fires in different regions across the world, and then pouring kerosene on it. But in the background of all of this, there's an arm industry that is maximizing wealth. Indeed, the shares of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics have been doing well for this past year. But war is also politics by other means. This was according to Clausewitz. And war is politics by with bloodshed, according to Mao Zedong. What has happened to American diplomacy? Why is the American leadership so quick to incite or take us to war? Why does every president since Bush feel the need to be a wartime president and present themselves as one during an electoral campaign trail? Here to tell us more, we're joined by Colonel Ann Wright. In her 29-year career in the Army and Army Reserve, Colonel Ann Wright served at the NATO Subcommand Allied Forces Central Europe, and later as a diplomat serving in the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. She resigned from the U.S. government in March 2003 in opposition to Bush's war on Iraq. She is an advisory board member for Veterans for Peace, International Peace Bureau, War Beyond War, Gaza Freedom Flotilla, No to NATO, Hawaii Peace and Justice, Pacific Peace Network, Women Cross the DMZ, and Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Colonel, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm I'm actually not doing so well because of the state of the world, where we have the U.S. involved directly in 2 conflicts in Ukraine, Ukraine and Gaza. We have U.S. troops in Syria, Iraq, Philippines, South Korea, Japan. Here in Hawaii, where I live, is one of the most militarized states, and the island of Oahu, one of the most militarized islands in the world. So um, it's a tough world when you're trying to have peace, and yet, as you have so um, rightfully identified, the history of the United States is pretty sordid in terms of using war rather than diplomacy to resolve international issues.
Absolutely, yes. So let me ask you something. So what happened to the days, you're a diplomat, uh, in your career. And what happened to the days of the Kennedy team, for example, doing backroom diplomacy with Khrushchev to avoid nuclear confrontation with the USSR, or Reagan engaging with Gorbachev to achieve armed control in Europe with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty? Why are we getting egomaniacs like Cheney, Rumsfeld, Trump, Bolton, buffoons like Nikki Haley, Bill Blinken, mediocre mediocre presidents like Bush, Biden, and grifters like Obama? What is happening to American diplomacy?
Well, first, what's happening to the American electorate that elects these people? And here we are coming upon another presidential election, and it's up to the citizens of our country to ask the hard questions to these candidates about what they're going to do for peace in the world, or are they going to continue this never-ending giveaway to the weapons industries, as you've mentioned, and in fact, we do have a tribunal that's going on right now called Merchants of War, which is really, really an interesting one, where we have collected the evidence against these big corporations and what they are doing to people all around the world, getting paid for by our U.S. tax money, creating these weapons that kill people everywhere. Uh, as far as the politicians, we elect them, and we've elected some doozies. And that was when I was in the U.S. government, and both in the Army and in the diplomatic corps. I mean, you're really at the mercy of who gets elected in the United States, who becomes president, and uh, what their policies are. And they've been pretty consistently over diplomacy. The one thing I'll give President Trump credit for, and this is about the only one, is that he did actually use diplomacy with North Korea. And we almost came to an agreement of some sort with the North Koreans, um, until a warmonger, John Bolton, stuck his nose into it and blew the whole thing up. But Trump did have 3 meetings with Kim Jong Un, and one would hope that Biden would have picked up on that. We would have hoped that Biden would have continued the work that was done under the Obama administration when he was vice president, for God's sakes, for 8 years. He was vice president with Obama, and that's when we had the deal with the Iranians on the nuclear program that they have, not going into nuclear weapons, which it still hasn't. But it's not because of anything the U.S. has done after Trump blew that agreement up, and Biden has not rolled back the sanctions that the Trump administration put in on Cuba. There's so many things that Biden has left in place that it's almost like Biden is Trump's poodle, lapdog on so many issues that should have been changed on the first day that Biden came into power. So it is up to us as the citizenry to pin down these politicians on what their beliefs are and recognize that we're going to get lied to, that's for sure. But then to try to hold them accountable in some way as this lying is going on. And that's where you see now the huge demonstrations that are going on all over the country about the Biden administration uh, uh, supporting every criminal act that the state of Israel is doing on Gaza and the West Bank.
So why is that? Because you mentioned that it's up to the electorate. I mean, the last electoral cycle, uh, foreign policy hardly even come up. I'm not doing a lot of activism nowadays, but when I were in the streets, there seemed to be not a lot of interest of what's happening abroad. We were like doing the marches or doing the rallies for Black Lives Matter, for example. We get like amount of people on the streets, right? But when Trump assassinated Somalia, for example, we tried to do a rally. We only get like 40 people show up. So it seems like to be not to be an interest in what happens in foreign policy and the street. I also wanted to ask you. You mentioned about Obama. When he did the nuclear deal with Iran, for example, and then Trump comes into office and just dismantle it. How flimsy are these treaties that these presidents make, where it's so easy for the next president just to tear up? I mean, I just mentioned what happened with Reagan, for example, and his arms control with Gorbachev, and that arms control in Europe stood for a few decades until it was undone by Trump, I believe, right? Either Bush or
Well,
Trump.
it was
But
actually Bush.
Bush,
Bush 1 or Bush 2 started dismantling the ABM treaty and uh, coming out of all the arms control treaties, including Trump following in with his uh, coming out. But you're exactly right. I mean, how first the American public is not interested in foreign affairs until their kids get sent into it with a war, and then they perk up their interest. Interestingly enough, U.S. citizens have not been involved in Gaza, although there are Palestinian Americans that are in Gaza. Um, but this particular one with the
Israeli Americans too in Gaza.
and yes, you're right, absolutely. In fact, half of Israel is Americans, it seems like. And most of the extremist settlers are Americans, Israeli Americans. So you're exactly right.
Jacob from Brooklyn.
And from Brooklyn, there you go. Yeah. Uh, so it isn't until the U.S. Has kind of skin in the game that people become interested, and it's not to try to prevent it, to raise your voices before the U.S. gets involved in these military uh, conflicts. Um, it's after the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. So it's really important though that we during the campaign, whenever there are town hall meetings or any opportunity to be near the politicians or their staff, is to keep pounding on these foreign affairs questions because it's when we look at how much tax money, of course, is spent on weapons and the U.S. military versus the social programs that we should be having in education and health and infrastructure and things like that, it's over 50% of our tax money goes to war and the military. So it's in our best interest to talk about that and try to get the politicians to talk about it, and then try in whatever way we can to hold them accountable uh, for their not following through on programs that we hope will emphasize more the the education, health, and things like that of our own people, plus the health of people around the world so that they don't die when the US starts doing military operations on them.
Right, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned the because these wars, right? These conflicts, and they're they keep getting more and more. Like I said earlier, right? Since this century has started, been in a vicious circle of conflict, one after the other, and then you forget. I was talking to my son earlier today. He said we're listening to a podcast and about Gaza, and he was asking me what's going on, and then he mentioned that no one's talking about Ukraine anymore. Ukraine tends to be like old news here in the media, but it's still going. It seems like old news before, like that was like the last rave, right? That's like the last thing. Ukraine. But now, guys, like people just moved on to the next topic. Meanwhile, a lot of our poorest among us, have to suffer with austerity. They get cuts in social spending, cuts in this. Here where I'm at, they just closed down several schools because of cuts. And people just don't seem to put two and two together, because as the spending rises, I mean, we just rushed about $120 billion to Ukraine, like in 2 years. So like in 2 years, we've been keeping that war in life support, pretty much. The war could have ended a long time ago, but we've just been keeping it on life support. And then we just recently rushed another $100 billion to Israel, while the people that I see in corners asking for money and the lights, keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, what's going on here?
When you start having so many wars that you forget about one because there's a new one, it's a sad state of affairs when that happens. And when there are people still being killed in Ukraine and in Russia from that conflict, and when we know that the United States was the one that torpedoed the peace talks that were going on, German Chancellor Schroeder was having negotiations with the Ukrainians and the Russians. And finally, the Ukrainians said, the U.S. won't let us work on peace. And then the former prime minister of Israel also had some negotiations with the Russians and the Ukrainians, and the same thing happened. The United States and the UK torpedoed those peace talks. So there's no doubt the United States definitely wants to put as much pressure, military pressure on Russia, and I guess try to bring them to their knees as the Soviet Union was done when it overspent. But the Russian Federation is a whole different um, organization. It is a commercial business. It's not a communist business anymore. It's got plenty of money, and there's no way in the world the U.S. should be trying to destroy another country. And this whole idea that the U.S. will sacrifice the lives of so many Ukrainians and the ground of Ukraine to try to get after Putin and Russia when uh, Russia had been telling the US and NATO for decades, the red line for our national security of the Russian Federation is Ukraine. And Ukraine joining NATO is one of the things that just is not, it doesn't work for our national security. So please don't do this. And of course, the US kept going after it, provoking the Russian Federation. And sending U.S. Military special forces into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians in the Donbass region, the Russian-speaking area of Ukraine, and in a war that started in 2014 when the United States helped overthrow the elected government of Ukraine. So the U.S. Has bloody hands on so much of the conflict and the chaos that's in the world today. The same thing for Gaza, the never-ending total support for the state of Israel, no matter what it does to the Palestinians, is terrible for our own national security. I can only imagine that after what all's gone on in Gaza and now in the West Bank, that, if you think 9/11 was bad, I would think that there are a lot of people around the world that are saying the US needs to have a little dose of its own medicine. And karma is not easy when you are killing people around the world. So for our own national security and the safety of people in the United States, the US needs to back off this blind support for whatever the state of Israel does to the Palestinians.
Absolutely. So, let me get to Gaza because I also want to talk about your declaration at the United Nations recently. But first, let's talk about a little bit about your diplomatic career and how did you switch from being a diplomat for the state and to become for people to people diplomacy, a diplomat for peace.
Yeah, well, I first was in the U.S. military. I joined the Army right after college. It wasn't that I came from a military family or I wanted to be a part of the war on Vietnam. What I wanted to do is to get the hell out of the state of Arkansas, where I grew up. So that's like so many young people getting out of something, leaving home, trying to get educational benefits, things like that are important. It's not that one generally joins because you really firmly believe in the foreign policies of the United States. Although after 9/11, there were a lot of people that joined up because the U.S. had been attacked and they wanted to be a part of pushing back on that. My first career I had was with the U.S. military. And the reason I stayed in was that I was very lucky. I had good leaders. I didn't have sexual harassment, and I was never sexually assaulted in the military, which during that period, which was less than 1% of the US Army were women back in the 1960s. So I was a very lucky person. Um, very few of the people I started out with in the Army stayed for a full career. Um, I ended up getting off active duty to join the State Department after I'd had an assignment at the U.S. Southern Command and had worked a lot with uh, U.S. embassies in Central and South America. And I thought that was a very interesting career, or that was a very interesting way to work on foreign policy. And at that point, I was a senior lieutenant colonel. So a lot of my friends were aghast, saying, "You're going to get out of the active army, go into the reserves, and join up with the State Department as kind of a second lieutenant diplomat. Geez, you're too old for that." But it was like, yeah, I'm getting old. And quite honestly, that PT at 4 in the morning, it was like, oh God. And I knew diplomats didn't do that.
Yeah, it wasn't working for you, right?
That's right. My feet and my legs had already given out. But anyway, so I joined up with the State Department in 1987 and ended up, as you mentioned, I was in U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia. I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December of 2001 and stayed there for about 6 months, and then went on to what turned out to be my final assignment, which was the deputy ambassador in Mongolia. And it was there in March of 2003 that I resigned from the government in opposition to that pending war. It was an imminent war that the Bush administration was going to do on Iraq. And I became the third U.S. diplomat to resign in opposition to the war on Iraq. And so I've been resigned from the government for 20 years now and have been working with the various groups, as you mentioned in that introduction, to say that war is not the answer and that diplomacy, citizen to citizen diplomacy, and government to government diplomacy is the way to resolve the issues of our world. And you'd mentioned the UN Security Council. Well, I was invited to be a briefer at a committee hearing of the UN Security Council. And this committee was on weapons transfers, and particularly on weapons transfers to Ukraine. I ended up getting an invitation to speak based on my military career and my State Department career. If you ever get an invitation, jump at it. And so here I was sitting at the horseshoe table that you see at the UN Security Council. It was eerie of like, I'm sitting here with the permanent members of the Security Council and the 10 temporary members that are through this session, and I get to speak. So I'm trying to figure out how much you can say, and the whole issue of weapons transfers, of course. Weapons transfers make sure that wars continue. So that was my theme, essentially, that the U.S. was transferring weapons, huge amounts of weapons into Ukraine, so that war would continue. And if you ever want the wars to stop, you've got to stop transferring weapons in. And the same for the Russians. The Russians have had mostly their own domestic weapons productions, but in the last 2 months, there have been articles about North Korea providing weapons to Russia, and no doubt that they are purchasing some on the international market too. My main argument was wars will continue, conflicts will continue as long as these weapons transfers go on. And I took the opportunity to say the U.S. is involved in two major conflicts right now, the one in Ukraine and Russia and the one with Israel and Gaza.
Yeah, let me load a clip for us to hear.
To be able to speak today on my concern about the issue of weapons in conflict areas, Ukraine for sure, and other areas of the world. I myself was in the U.S. military for 29 years. I retired as a colonel. I taught the law of land warfare and Geneva Conventions at the JFK Center for Land Warfare, Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. I was in the U.S. Army during the U.S. wars on Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Grenada, Panama, and the Central American wars in El Salvador, Honduras, and Panama, Nicaragua. I was also a U.S. diplomat for 16 years and served in U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan in December of 2001. I was a part of the United Nations operation in Somalia in 1993 and 94. I was the head of the Justice Division for UNISOM for almost 6 months, where we tried to recreate the Somali police, judicial system, and prison system. 20 years ago, I resigned from the federal government in opposition to the war on Iraq. Since then, I've been working with groups around the world to say that war is not the answer, that we've got to use diplomacy, that we've got to stop killing people, and work to control weapons. I recounted my history, the unfortunate familiarity conflict areas in many regions of the world, and our challenge on reliance of many countries, including my own country, the United States, on military action instead of diplomacy to resolve disagreements and conflicts. As a retired colonel and a former diplomat, I speak on my own behalf, but as a concerned citizen who, as a taxpayer, pays for the weapons my country uses and sells to fuel wars that kill innocent civilians. And I thank very much the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs for your noting, of course, that it's civilian casualties. It's the need that we have for protecting civilians in these conflict areas. There's no doubt that the weapons supplied into conflict areas have, to say generously, a detrimental effect on the prospect for settlement of these conflicts. In fact, the continued supply of weapons will prolong any conflict. So the important question, I think, for the Security Council is how do you get the conflicts to end? Well, we know in this institution particularly, it is very well known within your halls, the process for getting to resolution of conflict is long, and many people are killed until there's an agreement for a ceasefire as a first step. Now, I'd just like to do a little history of how long these agreements may take us to get to where no more people are killed. The 3-year Korean War from 1950 to 1953, it took the discussions for ceasefiring began in 1951 and finally concluded after 575 meetings in 1953. But during that time, over 4 million Koreans, 500,000 Chinese, 35,000 U.S., and tens of thousands that were in the UN military command were killed. Right now, the United States is providing weapons in 2 conflicts, the Ukraine-Russia conflict and Israel-Gaza. I know much more about, because I'm an American citizen and watch this stuff, how much military equipment is being provided by my country. Just 4 or 5 days ago, on December 7th, in a press conference with the UK Foreign Minister David Cameron, Secretary of State Blinken said that in the last 2 years, the U.S. has provided over $70 billion to support Ukraine, and European allies have provided over $110 million in weapons. Blinken said, if you look at these investments that we've made in Ukraine's defense to deal with this aggression, 90% of the security assistance we've provided has actually been spent here in the United States with our manufacturers, with our production, and that's produced more American jobs, more growth in our own economy. So this has been a win-win that we need to continue.
I'll put it on the notes. So, Ann, this is what it seems to be all about.
Yeah, it sure is. And continued on, I said, and the win-win is definitely not for the civilians in the area. The win-win is for the merchants of death. It was an opportunity to give a little bit different flavor, I think, to the UN in terms of really going after the weapons manufacturers and war in general. And I ended my presentation with a part of a poem that has been written for the children of Gaza, but it's actually for the children of all conflicts. And it's titled is Mama, Put My Name on My Leg. And it's for all the kids that over 8,000 of them have died in Gaza in 2.5 months. Kids' body parts are being found. They don't know who this little kid is or what body part, but if there's a name on a leg, that they think maybe they can identify it. It's just, the most grotesque thing in the world that we still have war at resolving problems rather than talking them out.
Absolutely. But it seems to me there is no interest to talk it out, because it seems that there's a disconnect between leadership, the governed and the government, leaders and the led, for at least for this Gaza, for this, the ethnic cleansing. I mean, you got to call it ethnic cleansing. That's what it is. Genocidal war in Gaza. I believe the poll said like 60% of Americans are against it, and that's bipartisan, Republican and Democrat. However, our leadership seems to be lockstep, bipartisan. There was recently a vote recently in the House where they equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitic, right? And everybody voted for it. The only vote against this resolution was a Republican congressperson, I forget his name. And then Rashida Tlaib, I think she voted present, but she didn't vote yea or nay. But everyone voted for it to equate Zionism with anti-Semitism, which is two different things. But it seems like not only the leadership, the mainstream media as well, they're like lockstep on one particular narrative, whereas the population are in the other direction.
Well, it's true. Although now it seems like it's like 70% of the American public says that the genocide of Israel has to stop. And so it's uh, more and more the people of the United States and around the world, of course, have seen what's going on, and the pressure that's been put on the Biden administration has resulted in some change in at least the rhetoric that the administration's using. They still come out totally in support of Israel because it's defending itself, but they are now at least saying that Israel has to be careful for civilian casualties. Of course, Israel isn't. Um, and the administration is talking about kind of what happens after Palestine, and one of the what happens after the Israeli uh, genocide stops. And they're saying concepts that I don't think an American administration has talked about really about no longer having a siege on Gaza, although there's nothing left of Gaza. The rhetoric is changing from the administration, but unfortunately, the the actions of the Israeli government are not changing. So the Biden administration's trying to have it both ways. They're trying to pacify the the U.S. public by saying we're really telling the Israelis they can't kill everyone, and but Israel does have its right to defense until the last Gazan is dead. It seems like uh, so. We have to keep after them. I mean, in Washington, D.C., I've been in Washington for the last in and out for the last 2.5 months, and going to Congress every single day and talking to staffers, trying to catch congressmen and women in the hallways to talk about a ceasefire, having demonstrations at the White House. You know, we do know that there's dissension in the administration. We know that White House staffers are um, have written a letter to Joe Biden. We know that several dissent letters have been written to Tony Blinken as Secretary of State. USAID had over 1,000 of its employees write to the administrator Samantha Powers. So even within the government, there is a big split on what should be happening, and one would hope this would have resulted in the U.S. Uh, not vetoing any ceasefire resolutions in the UN, but it didn't a week and a half ago. And right now, we're in the third day of negotiations where a vote on another ceasefire has not come up because the U.S. refuses to go along with a complete cessation of military activity of Israel bombing Gaza. So for 3 days, they've been talking to the U.S. because the UN Security Council does not want to have a veto. Well, even if it passes, it doesn't mean Israel is going to go along with whatever the ceasefire that Israel has to go along with what the UN says. It's the negotiations behind the scenes between Israel, Qatar, UAE, Egypt, and the US. That's where the decision will be made whether or not there's a ceasefire. So actually, the vote in the UN Security Council, it is a symbolic action and it should be taken, but it really is meaningless as far as what really happens on the ground in Gaza.
I mean, there are actions that can be taken. For example, when going back to Gaza, when Riyadh had the recent meeting, I believe it was 2-3 weeks ago. Hold on. Yeah. So when Riyadh was having about a meeting with I believe it was the Arab League and others, there were suggestions to put like an oil embargo, like it was done back in 1973, and the majority of the Arab states pretty much shot it down. They won't do that. So everyone's listening in the sideline, but uh, no one is taking any action, just rhetoric. I mean, and one of the things that happened, immediately after Israeli assault in Gaza, right, was the U.S. sending battle groups as the way to intimidate the other state from getting involved. What does that do? There are measures that can be taken against Israel uh, that doesn't require a military intervention. If you recall, back in the pretext for invading Iraq was because Iraq violated like 8 UN resolutions, right? Israel had violated like 30 of them. There are measures that doesn't involve an armed conflict, cutting gas. I don't like to say sanctions because sanctions get weaponized, but there are measures that could do that, can discipline, that can hold Israel accounted for. But the U.S. and the Western states refuse to. They allow the Zion state to operate with impunity. They put kids in the sand. They look the other way. They make excuses for them. Uh, what does that do to the international system?
Well, it means that the international system is impotent, that it doesn't do anything. It only does things to countries of color. I mean, the sanctions and all of that go on to African countries. I mean, and the West goes right along with that. But here you have a European country, essentially, that happens to be in the Middle East, but nobody's taking any action. I mean, it's the Hezbollah in Lebanon that's fired some missiles into Israel. The Houthis all the way over in Yemen have fired some missiles. That's about it. Not that I want a violent response, but the whole issue of boycott, divestment, and sanctions is very powerful. And while the governments may not take action, certainly the public can. I mean, should not be one thing that comes from the state of Israel that should be purchased by us here in the United States or in Europe. We should be going out to the airports, and for every El Al flight that flies into JFK, Newark, Boston, Los Angeles, Miami. We should be trying to get the unions, the airport workers unions, to not unload the baggage off those planes, and we should be having or asking Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, members of the Jewish community to go out and talk to all these people that are getting off the flights straight from Tel Aviv right to those cities and talk to them about what is really happening, because most of these Israeli citizens, I fully believe, are not so aware of the level of destruction that has happened in Gaza. The reports are that Israeli TV does not cover as Al Jazeera does, and every now and then as ABC, NBC, and all of those. Um, so a lot of Israelis don't realize what has happened in their name by their government. So whatever we can do to isolate the state of Israel, to boycott the products coming out of it, and putting a real hurt on the people of Israel, and I would say the rest of the world ought to do the same thing to us, that we ought to be under sanctions because our government is complicit in this. And we, the citizens, if we start feeling that we're not getting, countries aren't sending things to us, we don't have the purchasing power, that really puts an initiative into people to really uh, give it to the government about their policies. But of course, nobody ever takes on us, the United States, for all the things that we've done. There should have been boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the U.S. for Afghanistan, for Iraq, for all of these things, but no, uh, nobody would do that. And yet it was the thing that would show the war to it would show to the United States and the U.S. government what the world felt about these military operations that the U.S. has been doing.
I mean, you have Ansarullah in Yemen. I mean, they pretty much have a de facto embargo on Israel. by stopping the ships going to the Red Sea, uh, destined to go to Israel. So it's economically, I've read report that it is taking its toll in Israeli economy, what Israel is doing. But in the same token, you have Lloyd Austin pretty much, putting together a quote unquote coalition of the willing, you know, of military assets to go into the area to stop the Ansarallah from affecting an embargo on on Israel. Seems like sanctions and embargo. It seems like the West is the only one that they are allowed to do. No one else can do that.
Only we could do that.
Yeah.
I'll just mention, I was in Istanbul about a month ago, and it was for the Gaza and trying to see what plans we might have to try to actually challenge the continuing Israeli naval blockade of Gaza. While we were there in Istanbul, the organizers in Istanbul said to us who had come from 10 different countries for this meeting, would you all like to fly out to Incirlik, to Adana, Turkey, out in the eastern side of Turkey, where there is a U.S. military base? And you probably remember Incirlik from being in the military. Well, it is an air base that the U.S. is using to fly military equipment from Europe. Then they land at Incirlik, and then from Incirlik, they go on into Israel because it's only like a 30-minute flight from Adana, Turkey, down to Tel Aviv. So the Turkish groups we were with said, we're flying out to Incirlik, and we're going to have a big demonstration out there saying we don't want Turkish soil used to be able to transfer weapons into Israel. So there were thousands of Turkish citizens that had come by car from all over Turkey to be a part of that demonstration. And then while we were there, we ended up spending the night out at a warehouse area for one of the big Turkish NGOs that does a lot of work in northern Syria. There's so many refugee camps that are in northern Syria. And they were telling us that there are 28 U.S. military bases in northern Syria. I mean, these are small bases, but they are the U.S. footprint. And we know that there have been missile attacks on some of these bases since October 7th, that various groups are saying to the U.S. military, we don't like what you're doing in supporting Israel. We were all the way out there in Adana, Turkey, and then we asked, what is the feeling of the people around the city of Adana? We've gone out to the military base, and we don't like that base being used to transfer military weapons. And they said, well, it's really interesting because Israel has used the ports that are just south of Adana, Turkey, as one of the commercial ways that Turkish businessmen and commercial interests have had a large business with Israel. And so they were telling us, they said, it's really difficult to get our own businessmen to boycott Israel now because this has been their lifeline for 20 years now. So it's a double-edged sword how all of this works on the sanctions and who is getting who's going to lose money if products are sanctioned for Israel.
Yeah, and on the sanctioning Israel, I mean, the Trump administration called that the biggest diplomatic breakthrough is what they were doing with the Abraham Accords, right? And with
Yeah.
the Abraham Accords, the Trump administration gave Israeli the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory. The achievement that Trump's talking about, the Abraham Accord, it was to all the Arab states to make peace with Israel as if they were at war with each other. They're not at war with each other. So why you have to make an accord to make peace with Israel, right? They already have trade with each other, right? So what was the purpose of the Abraham Accord? Some say that it was to formalize it. And by doing so, it pretty much will bury the Palestinian question forever. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right. That was the purpose of it, is trying to bury the rights of the Palestinians. Another part of that also was the Trump family uh, financial benefit from it. where you have Jared Kushner, who now has an equity firm with Saudi Arabia in the billions of dollars. So there was an economic benefit from to going to some of Trump's family and key advisors on this Abraham Accord. And of course, part of it was moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something that was prohibited. I mean, prohibited through the Oslo Accords, prohibited everywhere because it was a flashpoint in relations with the Palestinians and really with the rest of the Arab world. And Trump went ahead and did it and got away with it. So the Abraham Accords, I think, are in tatters now, and as they should be after what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians. They never should have happened uh, because Israel has done nothing to help the Palestinians, and instead these accords were to essentially be a gift to Israel for its brutality on the
Yeah,
Palestinians.
it would condone and normalize Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, and it
Yeah.
would be seen as business as usual.
Yeah. So the accords, the more of them that are dumped until there is the recognition in Israel that their actions have to show respect for the Palestinians, which will take, you know, 50 more years before they'll ever overcome the hole they've dug themselves in this 78-day genocide that they've done on the Palestinians. And in fact, I don't think they'll ever be able to dig out of this hole. I
And
think they've created such a security nightmare for their own selves. It's a very dangerous thing that they've done for themselves and for the United States.
And do you think this action that they've taken will backfire on them? I mean, do you think the global majority will forget about this? I mean, the global majority is up in arms about this. They're not able to do anything more directly because they don't have the means to, but the public opinion is enraged over what's happening right before our eyes. I believe the first genocide or ethnic cleansing that has been done in broad daylight, where everybody can see. But do you think do you think they will have repercussion for the United States based on what they're doing?
Well, I certainly hope it has terrible repercussions for them. They should not be able to get away with this. I mean, there have been some other genocides. I mean, you look what Milosevic did in the Muslim Serbs. You look in Rwanda where 2 million were killed and the genocide there, and people were held accountable afterwards. So it is up to us to keep the pressure on, and it won't be through the US government for sure, but it'll be through civil organizations which are already filing lawsuits in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice uh, on the issue of Israeli actions in Gaza. So we have to keep supporting those organizations and other and countries that are willing to step up and be a part of these lawsuits. 155 countries voted in the UN General Assembly for a ceasefire in Gaza. So there are lots of countries that are so outraged about what Israel is doing, and I certainly hope boycott and sanctions happen to the state of Israel. They should be happening right now.
It's funny you mentioned earlier about sanctioning us. Symbols of America have been sanctioned. I was reading about the terrible financial cost that McDonald's and Starbucks have been having because of
Yeah.
this. I mean, I read that in some countries they're being shutting down because of the people boycotting these businesses that are symbol to America.
And these corporations are trying to distance themselves from what the franchises in Israel have been doing, which is essentially giving away these products, McDonald's hamburgers and Starbucks coffee to the Israeli soldiers. And the boycotts have been so strong, and in fact, they were going on in Turkey when I was there. Coca-Cola is another one that's boycott. There was a whole list of them, and as we would go into the markets, uh, and stop at places that our Turkish friends would say, "Oh, you can't buy this. That's on the boycott list. You can't do this, boycott." So things like McDonald's and Starbucks have had to come out to say, "Listen, this is not us as an international policy. This is something that Israel did, but don't take it out on us. But people are.
Absolutely. Well, and I think there's a good place for us to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for coming onto the show and sharing your time with us, your thoughts, your experiences. Where can we find your work?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I do have a website. It's called voicesofconscience.com, and I list the articles that I've written and the speaking engagements and things like that. I do a lot of articles. In fact, I've just had one that has come out on Julian Assange, and a previous one that, of course, was on Gaza. So all of those are listed on voicesofconscience.com.
And where can we find information and actions or actions, listeners should consider on the topics that we hit today?
Well, if you just Google Palestinian protests in the United States, there are 4 or 5 different websites that will pop up that will have uh, listings state by state by state of things that are happening. So in your own community, you can find what's going on. Veterans for Peace, Code Pink Women for Peace, Peace Action, all of these organizations have on their websites um, actions that you can take and petitions you can sign and the telephone numbers of your congresspersons and the White House and the Department of Defense. So there's a lot of material out there so that before you finish breakfast every day, please call your congresspeople, write them, email them. There's a lot we can do no matter where we are in our communities.
Let me ask you something. Do you recommend writing email or hand and paper?
Uh, I think email's certainly the easiest, and these are counted and they're printed out in the congressional offices. That's one of the things that we ask the interns when we walk into an office. Have you been getting a lot of phone calls today on Gaza? Have you been getting a lot of emails? And we ask them, how many have you gotten? And they'll go to their list and tell you, well, today so far we've gotten 50 calls and we've gotten 15 emails, and if they get handwritten letters, they'll say that. So they are supposed to be keeping count of it, and from what we see, they are. So it's whatever's the easiest. If it's easier for a person to write something and handwrite it or type it up and then put it in an envelope and send it, although it takes a long time to get through all of the security parts of getting things to the White House and the Congress. So the emails go through fast, like instantly, and I would recommend using that if people are comfortable with it.
Yeah, it's just so disappointing getting those automated emails back. you know, and you
Oh
feel like,
God.
did they even read it?
Well, they do, and at least somebody has gone through to at least figure out the topic that you had talked about and send you the form letter for that topic. So but then to call and see if you can't get time with one of the staffers and develop a relationship with one of the foreign affairs staffers or the legislative aides is hard to do, but it's worth it when you can sometimes get somebody on the phone that'll talk to you. But then to make sure that you don't drone on forever, that you have a little elevator speech, 2 or 3 minutes long, and then that's it, because these folks definitely are very, very busy and they don't have time for our what we would like to do is a 20-minute oration on our feelings on whatever topic.
And any last comments before we depart?
Well, keep after them, keep going. It's up to us as citizens to affect change in our own governments, and certainly the fact that the United States uses wars instead of diplomacy is something we have to keep after them on.
Thank you, Anne. For
Thank you.
coming. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main epistos free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, Scott Spalding, Spooky Tooth, Helgeberg, and Howard Reynolds. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain you long.
www